What if I told you that the most dangerous enemy of a frontier dweller was not man or wild nature, but an ordinary 8-hour night? In the endless prairies and mountains of the Wild West, where there were no walls or roofs, sleep turned from rest into the most vulnerable state. To fall asleep meant becoming defenseless against the icy wind, a sudden storm, or the quiet approach of danger. Every evening became a test that had to be passed in order to see the next sunrise. A mistake in choosing a place, an incorrectly built fire, or a wet blanket could be fatal. They slept literally on the ground, but they did so in such a way that their sleep was a fortress. Watch the video to the end to find out how these people slept under the open sky, surrounded by dangers, and what forgotten techniques allowed them to meet the dawn. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival, which has nothing to do with equipment or fire building skills. It is about a fundamental change in consciousness and attitude towards sleep. For a frontiersman, trapper, or scout, sleep was not a complete disconnection from reality, as it is for a modern city dweller. It was more of a state of reduced activity in which alertness was never completely turned off. This skill was not innate. It was acquired through years of harsh practice and constant exposure to risk. These people trained their minds to wake up not from loud noises, but from their sudden cessation. They learned to recognize the slightest changes in the nighttime symphony of sounds: unnatural silence, the crack of a branch that could not have been caused by the wind, or a subtle change in the behavior of nocturnal creatures. They consciously avoided places that seemed most obvious and convenient for spending the night. A cozy, wind-protected clearing by a stream was exactly the place where they would be looked for first. Instead, they often chose uncomfortable but hidden and strategically advantageous positions. For example, a frontiersman might prefer to sleep on a rocky slope, among thick bushes where he was difficult to spot. He sacrificed physical comfort for tactical advantage. It was a conscious choice in which safety always came first and comfort last. This fragmented sleep, consisting of several short cycles, allowed the brain to remain alert. Deep sleep was a luxury they could not afford. Every hour they could instinctively wake up for a few seconds to look around and listen before falling back into a shallow slumber. This psychological aspect was the basis of their survival. Without this mental shield, no blanket, even the warmest bison hide could protect them. They understood that the main battle for life took place not during the day, but at night, inside their own minds. Even the process of falling asleep was a ritual. Before closing his eyes, the frontiersman would spend long minutes simply lying still and listening. He memorized the map of sounds around him so that any new addition to it would immediately raise the alarm. This constant mental strain came at a price, but there was no alternative. The ability to sleep while remaining alert was as important a tool as a rifle or a knife. It was invisible armor, forged from experience and instinct. Ultimately, their sleep was not passive rest, but an active process of observation. They did not sleep in the wilderness, but with it, becoming part of it. This philosophy was the first and foremost secret of their nighttime survival. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about this kind of psychological training and the ability to control your own sleep? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next studies.
And with yourself.
Are you ready to learn the truth about what a bed in the wilderness really was? When a frontiersman decided to stop for the night, the first thing he did was not to build a fire or prepare food. He began to prepare his bed, and this process was critically important. Sleeping directly on the bare ground meant guaranteeing to give all your warmth to the cold ground. After choosing a strategically safe place, he would begin clearing the area. All stones, branches, pine cones, and any other debris that could get in the way were removed from the ground. This was done not so much for comfort as to avoid making unnecessary noise while sleeping, such as tossing and turning on a dry branch. After clearing the site, the most important stage began: creating an insulating layer. Damp and cold ground is the sleeper's main enemy. To combat it, a thick layer of dry material was required. In summer, this could be dry grass, leaves, or moss collected from the surrounding area. In winter or in the off-season, the best material was spruce or pine branches. The frontiersmen cut dozens of branches and laid them in several layers. There was a whole technology for laying them. The branches were laid on top of each other, like tiles on a roof, to create a lush and springy bedding. The thickness of this bedding was critically important. It had to be at least 15 to 20 centimeters thick to effectively insulate the body from the frozen ground. This layer of dry air, trapped between the needles and branches, was what retained the heat. Sometimes special indentations were made in this bedding. An experienced person would dig small holes for the hips and shoulders. This made it more comfortable to lie on one side and reduce pressure on the joints, allowing for some relaxation during the night. Blankets or skins were spread over this improvised mattress. But it was this base of pine branches or grass that was the key to a warm sleep. Without it, even the best bison skin would not have saved them from the piercing cold coming from below. This process took a considerable amount of time, sometimes up to half an hour, but it was a necessary investment in one's own survival. Skipping this step meant waking up in the middle of the night from the cold, completely exhausted. Every minute spent in the evening preparing the bed saved hours of suffering at night. This simple hunter's bed was the height of pragmatism. It required nothing more than a knife and knowledge of which plants and branches were best suited for the job. It was a daily ritual, repeated hundreds of times in different conditions. It seemed like a simple bed, but how much work and knowledge went into it? However, the bedding only solved the problem of cold from below. But how did they solve the main problem? The cold night air. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of a fire that burned all night without requiring supervision. What I am about to show you was the secret to survival in the most severe frost and was radically different from a normal campfire. This method could save the life of a traveler, hunter, or soldier who found themselves in the wilderness, where temperatures dropped well below zero. The simple campfire we see in movies is completely impractical for spending the night. It looks beautiful when the flames rise high into the sky, but this is an illusion of warmth. In reality, such a fire burns out quickly, requires constant feeding with wood, and only warms the side facing it. Turn away and your back is immediately covered with frost. Those who truly knew nature and lived side by side with it understood that the most important thing about a fire is not the height of the flames, but the quality of the heat. Frontiersmen, people accustomed to surviving in the harsh conditions of the northern wildlands, knew this better than anyone else. They used a completely different technology, honed by years of observation and practice. Their knowledge of nature replaced science, and their experience replaced any books. This method is often called anoia, or trapper's fire. Its purpose is not to produce a high flame, but to create a stable, long-lasting source of radiant heat. Outwardly, it looks modest, without spectacular flames, but that was precisely its strength. It was, in essence, a 19th century infrared heater that could burn for 6, 8, or even 12 hours without any intervention. Such a fire allowed one to sleep through the night without waking up from the cold or getting up to add wood. This was especially important on long journeys when people were exhausted and every minute of sleep was precious. Travelers, hunters, and scouts knew that anoia was not just a way to keep warm, but a guarantee of survival. Creating such a fire required careful preparation. It was a whole ritual that required patience and precision. It was not small branches that were needed, but 3 large, preferably straight and dry logs. Ideally, these were the trunks of fallen dry trees, at least 30 centimeters in diameter and 1.5 to 2 meters long. Only such logs could burn long, evenly, and predictably. Before starting to build the fire, experienced frontiersmen cleared the area of snow and grass, sometimes even digging a small depression so that the fire would not spread to the sides. There should be no moisture under the fire, otherwise the fire will not burn. If the ground was frozen, thin branches were placed underneath to create a grid for airflow. 2 logs were laid on the ground parallel to each other. This was the basis for the future fire. The secret was to create the right gap between them. To do this, Two small stones or damp logs were placed at the ends of one of the logs to serve as spacers. The gap between the logs had to be narrow, only a few centimeters, but the same along the entire length. It was this gap that turned the fire into a long oven without walls. Kindling was placed in this gap, like in a channel. Dry grass, small chips, birch bark. Experienced hunters often took with them pre-prepared pieces of resinous pine or bundles of dry moss. The kindling was lit along its entire length. Thanks to the draft created by the narrow channel, the fire burned evenly along the entire length of the logs. The flames were drawn inside, creating a steady smolder that did not require constant attention. When the kindling burned out and the main logs began to smolder, a third log was placed on top of them. It served two purposes. First, it pressed down on the lower logs, preventing them from rolling away, and second, it reflected heat downward and sideways, preventing it from escaping upward. This created a closed volume of heat that did not blaze but burned evenly and powerfully. The result was not a fiery extravaganza, but a slow, controlled smolder. The inner surfaces of the logs facing each other slowly charred, radiating an enormous amount of heat. This heat was directed horizontally, straight at the sleeping person. Even with a weak flame, the temperature near the fire could be so high that the snow began to melt at a distance of a meter. The bed was arranged parallel to this fire, at a distance of 1 to 1.5 meters. If you lay closer, you could overheat. Further away, you could freeze. To enhance the effect, an improvised reflector made of branches, boards, or a stretch blanket could be installed on the opposite side of the fire. Sometimes it was made of spruce, with the branches tilted at an angle so that they reflected the heat back. Thus, a person was sandwiched between the wall of fire and the reflector, in a cocoon of warmth. Even in the bitter cold, it was possible to sleep almost as if in a hut. The air between the body and the cloak remained warm, breath did not turn into frost, and it was possible to rest peacefully. Many claimed that this heat was softer and more even than that of a regular fire. This method required a lot of effort to prepare the firewood, but it paid off handsomely. It took a lot of effort to prepare 3 suitable logs, especially if there was no axe at hand. But the reward was priceless. The opportunity to sleep for several hours straight without waking up from the cold, and without risking setting your blanket on fire from a flying ember. Frontiersmen knew that Nodya was not about effectiveness, but about results. Where a regular fire had long since died out, this structure continued to radiate even heat. It required no maintenance, did not blind the eyes, and did not throw out sparks. It was a survival technology of the highest order. Simple, reliable, and time-tested. This system was so effective that it allowed people to sleep even in severe frost with only a blanket or raincoat. People who mastered this method could survive in conditions where others would freeze to death in a couple of hours. It demonstrates how a deep understanding of the physics of combustion and the ability to work with nature made it possible to solve the most difficult survival problems. This practice is a reminder that true knowledge comes not from books, but from observation and experience. After all, to make the perfect Nodya, you need to feel the wood, know its density, moisture content, and behavior in fire. This was the wisdom of people who lived in harmony with nature. If you find this information useful and impressive, please like this video. After all, who knows, maybe this ancient method will one day save someone's life. What if I told you that everything you believed about life on the frontier isn't entirely true? The image of a frontiersman is often associated with a complete lack of shelter. However, when it was possible and justified, they spent a little time creating the simplest roof over their heads. We're not talking about building a log cabin or a hut, but the most basic shelter, a single sloped canopy. Its purpose was not so much to keep warm as to protect against the 2 main enemies of sleep: wind and precipitation. Building such a shelter took a minimum of time, but had maximum effect. First, they looked for a suitable place. The ideal option was 2 strong trees growing 2 to 3 meters apart. Between them, at a height of about 1.5 meters, a sturdy pole was attached horizontally. This was the base of the roof, its ridge. A series of thinner poles or branches were laid at an angle to the ground from this pole. They served as rafters. Their lower ends simply rested on the ground. The frame was ready, and it took only a few minutes to build it. The next step was the covering. Starting from the bottom and moving upward, roofing material was laid on this frame. In wooded areas, it was the same spruce branches that were used for bedding. The branches were laid in dense layers, needles down, so that water would roll off them. In other areas, the bark of large trees, removed from fallen trunks, could be used. Pieces of bark were laid like large scales. Thick grass or reeds were also used if they grew nearby. Frontiersmen often carried a piece of oiled cloth, canvas, or even a simple blanket with them. In this case, the material was simply stretched over the frame of poles. This created a virtually waterproof roof under which it was possible to wait out heavy rain. Such a shelter was always built so that its rear, solid wall faced the prevailing wind. In this way, it blocked the draft. A fire was often lit in front of the open part of the shelter, and the shelter served as a heat reflector. It was the perfect combination of simplicity and functionality. The shelter was large enough to accommodate a person and all their equipment. It protected against precipitation, blocked the wind, and concentrated the heat from the fire. Despite its primitiveness, such a shelter was a huge step forward compared to sleeping under the open sky. It provided not only physical, but also psychological protection. How effective could such a simple shelter be in a real storm? In the next chapter, we will talk about the heart of the camp, the things that the frontiersman carried with him. The frontiersman's sleeping gear was heavy, bulky, but incredibly effective. In the 19th century, there were no synthetic insulators or lightweight fabrics. The choice was limited to natural materials, and two of them were unrivaled: wool and skins. The basis of any bed was a wool blanket, and not just one, but usually two or three. Wool had one unique and vital property that was worth its weight in gold. It continued to provide warmth even when wet. Unlike cotton, which instantly loses all its insulating properties when wet and begins to actively draw heat away from the body, wool fibers retain their structure. They can absorb up to 30% of their own weight in moisture before a person begins to feel damp. For a person living in the open air, this was equivalent to life insurance. Getting caught in the rain or wading across a river was a common occurrence. Falling asleep in a wet cotton blanket was a sure way not to wake up, while a wet woolen one gave you a chance to live to see the morning. That is why trappers and mountain people preferred heavy, thick wool blankets, often manufactured by the Hudson's Bay Company. These blankets were so valuable that they served as a unit of exchange. Their strength and durability were legendary. The pinnacle of sleeping gear was a bison hide, or, as it was called, a bison robe. It was a truly versatile item. It served as a mattress, a blanket, and even a raincoat during heavy storms. A bison hide with thick winter fur was incredibly warm. The thick skin provided excellent wind protection and was relatively waterproof. The fur, in turn, created a thick air layer that retained body heat. They usually slept with the fur facing up and covered themselves with woolen blankets. But in severe frost, a person would lie down on the blankets and cover themselves with the hide, with the fur inside. The thick fur clung to the body, creating an unmatched thermal cocoon. All this equipment, blankets, skins, and possibly a piece of canvas, was tightly rolled up into a so-called bedroll. This roll was tied with straps and attached to the saddle. It was heavy, but that was the price they paid for survival. This combination of materials, wool for wet conditions and fur for dry cold, was a system refined over centuries. It never failed and allowed a person to regain strength even in the most adverse circumstances. Are you ready to learn the truth about how people survived a snowstorm without a single tent? This is not just a story of bravery. It is the science of survival, proven by dozens of generations. In the wilderness, where the elements did not forgive mistakes, knowledge of the smallest details could mean life or death. The two main forces that threatened a sleeping person were water and wind. They were relentless. Water robbed you of warmth, Wind blew away your last reserves of strength. A frontiersman had to be able to withstand them, using only the landscape and his own wits. For an experienced person, a storm was not a death sentence. He perceived it as a challenge, as a test of his knowledge of nature. During rain, the main task was to stay dry. This was more important than staying warm because wet clothes in the wind are a disaster. Moisture penetrated the fabric, cooled the body, and could lead to hypothermia even at above freezing temperatures. Therefore, the first thing a frontiersman thought about was not fire or food, but staying dry. The first thing to do was to find a place that would not flood. It seems simple, but this is where beginners most often made mistakes. Puddles, hollows, and depressions were all traps that turned into pools of water by morning. Even a light rain could turn a cozy bed into a swamp in a matter of hours. Experienced hunters knew that dryness begins at altitude. You could never set up camp in a low-lying area, in the bed of a dry stream, or at the very foot of a slope. Water always seeks a way down, and even a weak stream could cut a channel right through your resting place. The frontiersman chose a small hill or a sloping slope so that water would naturally flow away from his bed. Sometimes he would check the ground with his palm. If it was firm and did not retain moisture, it was a good sign. This was how the first principle of waterproofing was observed. Find a place where nature itself helps you. If the rain was heavy, a shallow drainage ditch was dug around the improvised bed. This was done with a simple knife or even a pointed stick. This seemingly insignificant furrow in the ground could save you from getting wet all night. The ditch intercepted the streams of water flowing down the ground and diverted them away from the sleeping area. Sometimes, to enhance the effect, branches or stones were placed along the ditch to make the water flow faster. The aforementioned canopy, or a piece of oiled canvas, was used for protection from above. The canvas was often rubbed with animal fat or resin to make it waterproof. It could simply be stretched at an angle between two trees, with the ends tied to the branches with leather straps. If there were no trees, a person would wrap themselves in this fabric like a cocoon, lying down on a bed of pine branches or dry twigs. Such a shell allowed them to survive even a prolonged downpour without getting soaked to the skin. In particularly heavy rain, a double canopy was used. One layer was stretched low above the ground, the second slightly higher, so that the flowing water would not get inside. Sometimes a frontiersman could even dig a small hole and lie down in it, covering himself with a thick cloth, leaving only a hole for breathing. It looked primitive, but it allowed them to survive when the wind and rain turned the forest into a raging torrent. Snow was another problem, but at the same time it provided a solution. Dry snow is one of the best natural insulators. It traps air, and air is the best insulator. The main thing is to use it correctly and not let it melt from body heat and wet your clothes. A mistake could lead to a person waking up in an icy mess from which even a campfire could not save them. In the forest, the simplest shelter from the snow was a place under a large, spreading spruce tree. The dense lower branches created a natural roof, and underneath them, there was often a depression almost free of snow. It was a ready-made room, protected from the wind and snowfall. Often, you could even build a small fire or light a candle under the fir tree to add warmth. Dry needles served as excellent bedding, and branches served as walls. If the area was open, with only snow and wind around, you had to do something else. A frontiersman could dig a snow trench. He dug a hole down to the ground. As long as a person is tall, the snow was loose only on top, but dense at the bottom, and if you packed the walls properly, they held up great. From the dug-out snow, he built a solid wall on the windward side, sometimes even a roof if there was enough material. Such a simple shelter provided complete protection from the wind. Inside, it was quiet, like in a cave, and the temperature could be 10 degrees higher than outside. A person would lie down at the bottom of the trench on a bed of pine branches and cover themselves with blankets or a skin. They had to breathe carefully so as not to melt the snow near their face. Snow could even cover them from above, creating an additional insulating layer and turning the shelter into a kind of thermos. Experienced people knew how to choose the direction of the entrance, with their backs to the wind so that the draft would not blow away the heat. Sometimes they made a small ledge at the head so that the snow would not fall on them while they slept. These little tricks distinguished a novice from a master. Frontiersmen were observant. They noticed the direction of the wind by the bend of the branches, felt the frozen ground under their palms, and knew where to stop for a rest and where not to. They understood that even a small hill or bush could be a barrier against a storm. Everything was decided by details: the choice of location, the direction of the bed, the thickness of the bedding. What other tricks did these people use to choose a place? Why did one person survive in the cold, while another died despite having a fire and a blanket? In the next chapter, we will look at the strategy of choosing a campsite where a mistake in calculations could have fatal consequences. After all, survival is not a struggle against nature, but the ability to work with it. Choosing a place to spend the night was perhaps the most important decision a frontiersman made during the day. Not only comfort, but life itself depended on it. One wrong decision, and a person could wake up under water, under snow, or not wake up at all. It was a complex calculation that took into account dozens of factors: terrain, wind, humidity, shelter, visibility, even smells. Experienced people said that a good camp starts not with a fire, but with the right location. It was not only about comfort, but also about safety, because a night in the wilderness was a time when mistakes were costly. The first rule was to never stop for the night in an open, easily visible place. Open spaces were tempting because of their convenience. It was easy to build a fire and lay out your things. But this was a trap. In an open place, a person could be seen from any distance. Any movement, glimmer of fire or shadow could give away their presence. In the wild, visibility is the enemy of survival. The top of a hill or the center of a large clearing were strictly off limits. On high ground, the wind blew through and lightning struck precisely at such points during a thunderstorm. Even animals avoided sleeping there. In addition, it is difficult to retain heat on high ground. The air around is cold and constantly moving. The center of the clearing was also a bad choice. Too open, too visible, too dangerous. The frontiersmen knew that it was better to see than to be seen. This made the camp too visible to anyone who might be in the vicinity, whether a predator, a bandit, or just a curious traveler. Any light from a campfire attracted attention, like a beacon in the dark. Therefore, an experienced person always looked for a compromise, a place from which you could observe, but where you yourself were not visible. The second rule, no less important, was to avoid obvious dangers. The main one was the so-called widowmakers. These were large dry trees or individual dead branches that could collapse from a sudden gust of wind. Such trees often stood as silent ghosts among the living forest, and their crowns could collapse without warning. Experienced frontiersmen knew that the calm before the storm was deceptive. Even a light breeze could cause a dead branch to break off from a height and fall right on the camp. It was no coincidence that hunters said, "Look up before you look down." Branches that were dry, darkened, and broken at the ends were a clear warning. Spending the night under such a tree could be your last. The frontiersman always carefully examined the tree crowns above his intended sleeping place. He preferred to sleep under young, healthy trees or in an open area, but away from old forests, where every tree was a potential threat. He checked the trunks for cracks, signs of rot, moss, or leaning. This skill did not come from books, but from experience. Anyone who had ever heard the crack of a falling branch in the dark would never forget that sound. This rule was written at the cost of many accidents. Stories of those who died because of widow trees were passed on as warnings. Many old trackers taught young ones to start camp by looking up. After all, nature does not warn, it just acts. The third rule concerned water. The camp had to be located at a reasonable distance from a source, a stream, lake, or river. Too close meant dampness, fog in the morning, mosquitoes, and the risk of being spotted. In addition, the temperature near the water dropped sharply at night, and a person could freeze even in relatively warm weather. However, it was also impossible to stray too far from the water, as it was essential for drinking, cooking, and washing in the morning. Experienced hunters knew the golden rule. The camp should be within earshot of water, but no closer than 100 or 2 steps away. This way you could find a source even in the dark, while remaining invisible. The trails to the water were the busiest places in the wilderness. Animals, people, Indians, traders, and even predators following their scent walked along them. Setting up camp right on them meant exposing yourself to public view. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a risk. Even a trail leading to water could give away the camp, so frontiersmen always covered their tracks or chose detour paths. The optimal location was considered to be a few hundred meters from the water, hidden by terrain or vegetation, where bushes and trees formed a natural screen where the stream could be heard but not seen. Such a place provided both safety and peace. Even the smoke from the fire dissolved in the foliage, giving no indication of human presence. The fourth rule was terrain. One should never settle at the bottom of a canyon or deep valley. At night, cold air, being heavier than warm air, flows downwards. It's simple physics, but for a tired traveler, it could be deadly. The bottom of a valley is always the coldest and dampest place, where frost formed at dawn even in summer. In addition, narrow canyons were dangerous during rain due to the risk of flash floods. A short downpour somewhere far upstream was enough for the water to rise several meters in a matter of minutes. The torrent swept away everything in its path: campfires, shelters, and people themselves. An experienced person always chose a place above the potential water level. Sometimes they even left a mark, remembering the safe boundary. The ideal place was considered to be a so-called terrace or bench on a hillside, about halfway to the top. This place was sheltered from the wind, dry and comfortable. Water flowed downhill, cold air did not accumulate, and the location itself provided a moderate view. From here, it was possible to see the valley below, but remain invisible to those who were there. This location allowed him to control the terrain without giving himself away. From this level, he could spot approaching danger in advance: smoke, movement, sounds. The frontiersmen also paid attention to the prevailing wind direction in order to position the fire and shelter appropriately so that the smoke would be carried away from trails and water sources. All this analysis took only a few minutes for an experienced person. He did not stop, did not think long. He just felt where it was safe. His eye was trained, and his instincts had been honed over years. He could tell at a glance where the water flowed after rain, where the wind blew from, where the animals would pass. It was the art of observation, honed by thousands of nights and hundreds of storms. This skill was the essence of survival. Not strength, not weapons, but an understanding of the world around him. The frontiersman read nature like an open book, and therefore lived where others would have perished within a day. That is why choosing a place to spend the night was not just a habit, but a manifestation of wisdom passed down from generation to generation. As we mentioned in the first chapter, the frontiersman's sleep was vigilant. But in addition to psychological preparation, there were also practical methods for maintaining safety during the night. It was not enough to simply go to sleep. It was necessary to organize one's life in such a way as to minimize risks. If the frontiersman was not alone but part of a small group, the problem was solved by organizing shifts. The group took turns sleeping. While 2 or 3 rested, one person stayed awake, watching the fire and listening to the sounds of the night. It was the most reliable method, but it required trust and coordination. The sentry usually sat slightly away from the camp, in the shade, so that he would not be visible against the background of the fire. Every 2 to 3 hours, he was replaced by the next sentry. It was much more difficult for a lone soldier. He could only rely on himself. His entire safety depended on proper preparation for sleep. The first thing he did was arrange all his equipment in a strict, unchanging order. His rifle always lay to his right, within reach, covered with the edge of a blanket to protect it from dew. His cartridge belt, knife, and revolver remained on his belt or were placed on the other side. His boots always stood at the head of the bed so that he could put them on blindly in seconds. This meticulous order was vital. If he was awakened by a sudden noise, he would not have time to search for his weapons or equipment in the dark. He had to act instinctively, and his hands reached for the necessary items on their own. In particularly dangerous areas where unwanted guests could be expected, frontiersmen resorted to simple but effective alarms. Dry, crunchy branches could be scattered around the camp, a few meters away. Anyone who tried to sneak up in the dark would inevitably step on them and give themselves away with a characteristic crack. This gave the sleeper those precious half-seconds that separated a quick reaction from disaster. Sometimes equipment was used for the same purpose. For example, a pot or frying pan could be tied to a rope stretched between bushes at ankle level. An intruder would touch the rope, and the metallic clang would immediately wake up the camp. Sleep in such conditions was not rest but work. It required constant discipline and attention to detail. Even the position by the fire was important. They always lay with their feet toward the fire so that their heads remained in the cool shade, keeping them clear and alert. Let's now put all the elements together and see what the complete sleeping system that the frontiersmen set up every evening looked like. It was a multi-layered and well-thought-out construction, which could be called a taco by analogy with the way it was wrapped up. The base, as we already know, was a layer of insulation from the ground. It was a thick mattress made of spruce branches or dry grass that protected against the cold from below. This step was never skipped. The first layer of equipment was spread out on this bedding, a piece of oiled canvas, leather, or tarpaulin. This was the waterproofing layer. It was wider than the rest of the bed so that its edges could be folded over. The third layer, on top of the canvas, was a bison hide. It was placed skin side down and thick fur side up. This created a soft and incredibly warm surface for sleeping. The fourth layer was wool blankets. A person would lie directly on the bison hide and cover themselves with 1 or 2 wool blankets. The number of blankets depended on the temperature. Now came the most interesting part. The person lying on the fur under the blankets would take the edge of the bison hide and wrap it over the blankets, covering themselves with the hide as well. The result was a sandwich, fur on the bottom, fur on top. And finally, the final layer. The free edge of the lower canvas was wrapped over the entire pie and tucked under itself. The person found themselves inside a completely closed, waterproof and windproof cocoon. This system was incredibly effective. The outer layer of canvas protected against rain, dew, and wind. The inner layers of fur and wool provided powerful thermal insulation. The body quickly heated the small volume of air inside this cocoon. Saddlebags or rolled-up spare clothes were often used as pillows. Sometimes the saddle was placed at the head of the bed, serving as excellent wind protection for the head. Of course, such a cocoon was cramped and restricted movement. Getting out of it quickly was quite a problem. Therefore, in particularly dangerous situations, frontiersmen could sleep without wrapping themselves up so tightly so that they could jump to their feet instantly. This taco method was ideal for cold and damp nights when keeping warm was the main priority. It demonstrates how simple materials were used to create a highly effective portable life support system. The frontiersman's awakening was as quick and disciplined as his preparation for sleep. There was no time to linger or slowly come to. Morning was a dangerous time, and it was necessary to be fully ready as quickly as possible. They usually woke up before dawn, at the so-called wolf hour, when it was still dark, but the sky in the east was just beginning to lighten. This time was considered tactically advantageous. There was enough light to see, but not enough to be seen from a distance. First thing in the morning, without getting out of bed, a person would lie still and listen. They would try to catch any sounds that did not belong to the usual morning forest. Only after making sure that there was no immediate threat would they begin to act. Getting out of the warm cocoon into the frosty morning air was a challenge, but it strengthened the will. The first thing they did was put on their boots. They never walked barefoot, not even a few steps. If a fire had been burning during the night, it was immediately extinguished. This was an important ritual. The coals were carefully doused with water, if there was enough, or scattered and covered with earth. The frontiersman checked the ashes with his hand to make sure there were no smoldering embers left. A fire left unattended was not only a fire hazard, but also a factor that could give away their location. A column of smoke rising in the morning air was visible for many kilometers. Therefore, the fire was extinguished thoroughly and irrevocably. Then the packing began. The equipment was rolled up in reverse order. Woolen blankets were shaken out of frost or moisture and rolled up tightly. The bison hide was also rolled up. The canvas was folded last, protecting dry items. The whole process took only a few minutes. An experienced person could go from sleeping to full camping readiness, with all equipment packed in less than 10 minutes. This speed was the key to survival. There was also the practice of cold camping. If a frontiersman was in hostile territory or knew he might be watched, he did not light a fire at all. He stopped for the night at dusk, did not prepare hot food, and slept without a fire. In the morning, he would also leave before dawn, leaving no traces behind. The bedding made of spruce branches was dismantled and scattered, and the trampled grass was ruffled. The place where he had spent the night was left looking as if no one had ever been there. This discipline, this ability to appear from nowhere and disappear into nowhere, was the highest level of survival artistry. Sleep was not just rest, but a tactical stage in a long journey. We see that sleep in the wilderness for a person of the frontier era was not just a physiological need, but a complex, multifaceted science. It was an art that combined psychology, deep knowledge of nature, engineering ingenuity, and iron discipline. Every element, from the choice of location to the way the blanket was laid out, was honed by experience and was of critical importance. These people created shelters out of air, heat, and branches. The ground was their bed, and the sky was their roof. They proved that human adaptability and intelligence can overcome the harshest elements using only what can be found underfoot. Their legacy is not just stories, but fundamental lessons in survival. What other aspects of life on the frontier or in other eras would you be interested in exploring in such detail? Perhaps you are interested in their diet, navigation methods, or ways of obtaining water. Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.